All right. So welcome to this session of BDC Debate Academy. Of course, an amazing initiative, and I would like to thank BDC for giving me this opportunity. So, uh, the session that I'm going to take, the title of the discussion would be Development and Institutions, and I would just head right into this discussion. Um, sort of disclaimer is that I'm not going to link this discussion with any debate motion in particular. Uh, these are some of the discussions in the world of academia, which are, uh, in essence, contradictory, as in there are a lot of debates within these discussions themselves, and you might find them interesting because I found them interesting, and I'm currently pursuing my academic interest along this line. So, development and institutions is going to be the title, and so originally I was asked to uh, talk about the pathway for developing countries to develop. uh, so I am taking that working title as a sort of a question that I'm trying to answer in this video, in this session. So, what actually is the pathway for developing countries to develop, right? So, of course, there are many responses to it. In the world of development economics, you will see theories, neoclassical growth theory of Solow, you would see Harrod-Domer model, you would see Romer model. Of course, I'm not going to talk about these theoretical, these theories or these models or Rostos stages of growth. I'm not going to talk about them. I'm going to take the approach or lens of political economy, where politics and economics kind of interact with each other, and we'll try to see from that lens what we can find. So, my two responses to this question, I'll just go ahead and tell the answers. What I think is the pathway for developing countries to develop. Of course, there are many developing countries, and they are at different levels. They have different characteristics. So, but if we had to have some sort of common response for these countries to develop, to have economic growth, and also to have well-being of, in general, all the citizens, I would say there are two responses. A, good institutions. So by good institutions, I mean evidence informed, uh, good institutions or strong institutions, and also B, good policies. And by good policies, I mean evidence informed policy making, policies that are based on evidences. So I will start with this good policy part, and then I will go to the good and strong institutions part, and I will, in the process, I will try to link them somehow. Right. So there is this prevalent debate in the world of academia regarding development. How to, if you're a development organization like World Bank or UNDP, how do you ensure that a certain community or countries are getting developed, right? So there's this debate about whether we should focus more on aid or whether we should focus more on allowing them to grow their own markets indigenously. So let's explore that debate in a bit. So we have this proponent, this person Jeffrey Sachs, who wrote this book, The End of Poverty. And if I loosely translate or paraphrase or interpret what he said, is that poor people are poor because they don't have money. And there's the other reasons that people talk about are grossly overstated. Their primary problem is they need money. So the solution is we need to give them more aid. So his one original contribution would be to uh, take an integrated approach, because in development aid, you would see that households were the primary units of getting the benefits from an intervention. Instead of doing that, he took this approach where he went for an entire village and started working on health, education, agriculture, infrastructure, so that an entire integrated development occurs in a village. Very benevolent approach. And his core emphasis was on money, because when he came at the forefront, there were these other views that poor people are poor, or poor countries are poor because they have weak governance, they have bad institutions. But he uh, felt that this holding corruption or holding bad governances as the reasons, they are overstated, and these are his exact quotes, that the focus on corruption and governance is exaggerated, or Africa's governance is poor because Africa is poor. So his solution is uh, more foreign aid, so that they can be lifted out of the poverty trap. So he would make bold claims and bold statements, and he would want more people to come out of the poverty trap. And for this, he would ask for more foreign aid. And he thinks, because if let's say he provides this example, so in countries like in African countries, if you have malaria, and what happens is, if you have malaria, people tend to take more children because children die because of malaria. So you have more children because of that. You don't invest much in education. You probably educate one child, and thus you end up with a family where the children are not getting the nutrition, the health, the education that they require. So they are kind of stuck in this poverty trap. So we need to have this integrated approach where we need to work on health, where we need to work on education, where we need to work on livelihood. And for this, we need more money and more foreign aid. And thus, they would get rid of this ignorant and debt that hold them down. And then they would be able to solve their own problems. Now, this guy, William Easterly, who wrote this book, The White Man's Burden, and probably The Elusive Quest for Growth as well before that. But from this book, I got this response to this idea. He can be somehow dubbed as the intellectual archival of Jeffrey Sachs, because he says giving aid does not work. And instead, these countries should grow their own markets indigenously. And he thinks the real problem is not the poverty trap. The real problem is the aid itself, because the aid creates a culture of dependency where these countries and these communities, the people, they get dependent on aids. And according to him, the real roadmap to prosperity is the free market, and this culture of aid, the dependency of aid, holds them down, and hence they cannot go for free markets. And this is also reflective of this idea that in many countries growth occurred, or growth took place, because state kind of scaled back. So there were reforms. For example, China, because their response is that China did not really get foreign aid, China did not really get much foreign assistance. What they did was they developed their own market, and thus they came out of poverty and is on the way of growth. They have excellent growth rates. So what you need to do is, in former communist countries, what you need to do, or former countries where state was very strong as in state was very consolidated, in these countries states need to scale back and markets need to take more place, and thus growth will take place. And his problem with aid is, he says, aid has no feedback from poor, because when you are going from World Bank or UNDP or any other development organization, you are not really taking their voices into account, the poor people's voices into account. Also, the poor people cannot really hold you accountable for what you do to them, what you do with them, and what you provide them, because this is aid. And his proposition is, if it was a market, if it was a local market, or if it was their own government, they can somehow hold them accountable, as in, why did you provide me this? You can show your grievances. But with development aid, the poor people, the beneficiaries, they cannot really express that grievance, and they cannot really give that feedback, and they cannot really hold these development organizations or aid organizations accountable. And hence his focus would be on these countries, on these homegrown markets. But then again, this response also has a problem, because we need to understand whether these countries are actually prepared to provide that sort of accountability, even within the market as well. We'll get to that later when we discuss institutions. But so far we have seen two polls. I will get to them later. And then there is this group of people, uh, Abhijit Banerjee, Esther Duflo, who wrote Poor Economics. Their solution would be that there is not really a one size fits all solution. So there would be different solutions for different regions. You cannot really say, yes, we need more aid, so people are lifted out of poverty trap. You cannot make those bold claims. Also, you cannot say we don't really need aids. We don't really need aid, and all we need is develop homegrown markets. We need to see in a case by case basis, and you need to conduct experiments and see what actually works. So on the left we have Jeffrey Sachs who wants to give more aid. On the right we have William Easterly who wants homegrown markets, and in the middle somewhere we have Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo who wants to test and find out. So let's give an example. So I was talking about malaria, right? So Jeffrey Sachs' solution to malaria was, see, what we need to do is we need to provide them bed nets. We need to provide them bed nets, which I think which also had some sort of insecticide, so that those bed nets would protect the people staying inside them from malaria or such mosquitoes or insects, right? And we need to give it to them for free. William Easterly, on the other hand, his response would be, no, we don't need to give it to them for free, because giving it to them for free does not work. Many people use these bed nets for fishing, they use it as wedding veils, and they don't really value it. And his response is, people commit to the use of any product when they pay for it. So what he suggested, I think he provided an example of Malawi, that in the city where people were more affluent, they bought those bed nets for 5 USDs, and in the villages or in the remote areas or in the areas where people were poor, they bought those bed nets for 50 cents, and this price was subsidized from the profit that they made in the city areas. So the market itself created a measure where people are buying with this markup in the cities, and then the markup or the surplus is being used to subsidize the price in the remote regions or in the rural regions, right? And then we have Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo, and they would come and they would test what actually works. And what they found out is that actually giving bed nets for free worked better, because it meant more people were under the coverage, so more people had access to those bed nets than the places where people had to buy the bed nets with some sort of money. And also, even if subsidized, people who got them for free, the coverage was way higher than people who bought it with some money. But furthermore, the people who got the bed net for free the first time were more likely to pay for a bed net the second time. So if I got it for free the first time, the second time I'm more willing to pay for it. This is because I have got used to using bed nets, and now I have this habit, and now I understand the use of it. So the next time I'm probably willing to pay for it, as opposed to the William Easterly model, that if you have already paid for it, they are kind of less likely to pay for it again. That was the result of the test, but also that was the result of the test in a very certain region, in a very certain time place. And this is something that we need to remember about experiments, and this is something that we need to remember about all the places of the world, that they are different. Even within a country, all the places are not homogeneous. All the places, these places have different geography, different culture, the attitude of the people are different institutions, different realities. So it's important to test and experiment and empirically see what works and then going for them. But the problem with that is conducting these tests and conducting these experiments are again very expensive, and this is why for a long time we did not see these empirical tests or experiments in the development sector to see actually what works. Instead, we found big, flashy, fancy yearly reports with fancy pictures and fancy quotes. We did not really know the numbers. We did not really know if there was a control group and a treatment group, if there was an experiment with someone got the benefits, someone did not get the benefits, and whether the benefits actually changed significantly the fate of the people who received the benefits in comparison to the people who did not get. So we did not really know this data for a long time. And of course, Abhijit Banerjee, Esther Duflo, and people like them are making a change there. And we can see that there are these significant changes in development practices. Right. So that was this initial debate, the first debate that I wanted to discover within the world of development academia. Some people are saying that we need more foreign aid. Some people are saying no, foreign aid is, well, people cannot hold aid donors accountable. These aid, they're probably mismanaged. We need them to grow their own market. They need to commit to the products, and the market can itself devise a way where poor people are also protected. However, the problem with that idea is, as Jeffrey Sachs says, that these countries and these communities are not infrastructurally prepared. They don't have the necessary education or health or infrastructure to actually go for those markets. But also there is a bigger problem, is that these countries in those developing, these markets in those developing countries are probably not going to follow the proper property rights, proper access to market, and these are related to institutions, something that I'm going to point to in the next discussion. So if I were to have a takeaway from this, is that I would go with Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo. Yes, there are rhetorics on both parts, but we really need to see before a development intervention what works and what does not work. Although this is probably expensive, but we need to find out ways where more scientists, more economists, more social scientists conduct experiment in different regions and take a case-by-case approach and see which sort of aid actually works. There are instances where giving them money to get them, giving them the bare subsistence, that works. There are also examples where having a market works better, because having a market also works better because often we see that people provide solutions, development aid, that do not have a good understanding of the locality. So for example, if you are very used to using lakri or wood from your nearby forest and use it for cooking, and now I come and I provide you this fancy stove that is kind of inexpensive but also is good for environment, you are not going to automatically transition to using those fancy stoves, because you have a much cheaper alternative and something that you are used to. So we need to have an understanding of these local realities as well. Many of the development projects failed in achieving this behavioral change because they simply did not have this local understanding, the understanding of the local reality. And here Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee comes, and they kind of tweak these interventions with incentives here and incentives there. Maybe if you had a little more incentive for using that fancy stove, if it's important to use that fancy stove in the first place, if you give a little more incentive that if you use this stove, you will also get this. And sometimes they have seen that adding these incentives work wonder. But in order to do that, you need to actually test and experiment, and you need to find out what works, instead of just saying, okay, so this worked in Africa, so this is going to work in Bangladesh as well. This worked in India, so this is going to work in Latin America as well. So you need to understand their realities as well. So the takeaway would be good policies, good policy designs, but those policies need to be based on evidences, strong, hard empirical evidences, and based on those evidences, you can design programs for development organizations. Also, you can design those programs or policies of countries as well. And this is where we are going next when we talk about countries and states, because development organizations have certain agenda. They're probably going to work about only certain sustainable development goals. Certain organizations will commit to certain goals. Some organization will probably commit to women empowerment. Some organization will probably commit to better health or better education. But if a country in and of itself needs to do good for a longer period of time or in a very sustainable manner, what should this country do? What should these states do? And in the next section, we're going to explore that. All right. So in this next section, while I was preparing these slides and looking for Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo, I came across this interview of Esther Duflo, and I found it very fascinating because he really puts the focus on where it should be. So we often have this narrative, right, that poor people are poor because they're stupid, poor people are poor because they make bad decisions. And Abhijit Banerjee, kind of in this interview, talks about how that is a flawed conception, because a lot of the uh, blame here needs to go to the state as well, because how the state is structured. Because he says we often don't take into account how much states actually do for us. For example, in developed countries, for example, he talks about how UK has good water, because it's not that it always had good water, because it created a public service system where it can provide good water to all of its citizens. But there are countries which fail to do so, and this is why when you have poor people who don't get enough or much or the bare minimum public service from the state, and eventually they make bad decisions, because and the states also cannot restrain them because they are not providing them anything. This is something that he talks about in this next part. You will see that uh, poor people don't get their children immunized and British people are getting their children immunized. This is not because British people are inherently more conscious. Probably this is because there are better incentives at work. So if you're not getting your child immunized, you are probably not being able to send your child to school. You are probably not being able to access the healthcare service of NHS. So these are incentives which work, and for these punishments and for certain rewards, you eventually immunize your children because you have this information, and you are also getting this immunization service from the state. So since you are getting this public service from state, the state also has the right to kind of restrain you, or at least that's how you perceive it to be. So since you are getting something from state, you are also willing to comply or oblige with the state, and thus make good decisions or better decisions. So this is where we come in, and this is where we talk about states' role, the incentives, and how to keep people's actions in check. And all these discussions actually relate to the discussion of good institutions. Now, institutions, bureaucracy, I don't know why these are often not discussed as much as they should be in debates or even in intellectual communities or in our day-to-day discussions, because uh, often people misunderstand institutions to be institutes, as in physical manifestation or as in a physical organization like institute of this, institute of that. These are vastly different things. When we talk about institutions, let's first try to define institutions. So according to institutional economics, institutions are simply rules, the rules that we have in the society. So institutions can be divided into two parts. You can have formal institutions and you can have informal institutions. So the formal institutions are formal rules, the written rules. For example, you have to drive on a certain side of the road. You cannot smoke in a public place, you cannot smoke in a certain place. So these are written rules. If you violate them, there would be a formal organization, a formal agency that would come and that would enforce that rule on you, and will probably provide punishment for you, right? And if you do something good, and a formal organization and formal agency will provide a benefit or reward to you. And often these formal organizations or formal agencies are state government organizations or state governance agencies, so we kind of can interchangeably use them, because we have these formal rules enforced by formal organizations or government state agencies, and we kind of can interchangeably use the term formal institutions between them, right? So what are informal institutions? Informal institutions are the rules that exist in the society. You know that these are things that you can do, these are things that you cannot do, but you won't find them written anywhere. But sometimes the formal organizations or state agencies, they also follow these norms or values that exist in the society. But more often, these informal rules are enforced by informal groups of people. For example, let's say if you had to get a passport, so you know that you have to pay for, like, if you had to go for a driving license, so you know that for example, for license you need to pay 1000 taka, and if you pay 1000 taka, if you pass the driving test, you are supposed to get the driving license within this certain period of time. So that is like the formal rule, the formal institution. There is this agency, the organization, which is going to enforce this institution. But you probably are also aware of this informal rule that if you want this driving license, you need to pay 2000 taka extra to a certain group of people, and this certain group of people may involve brokers, agents, high level officials. We don't know, but this is an informal group of people. You don't explicitly know their hierarchy, but they enforce this informal rule that if you want that driving license, you need to pay this extra amount of money. And thus this informal rule is enforced by this informal group of people, this informal network, as we can say, and thus informal institutions are enforced. So the formal institution would be applying for the driving license, paying the due amount that is written explicitly everywhere in the website, and doing the due, going for the driving test. And that should have been enough, but that is often not enough, because particularly in developing countries, because you have an informal group of people who are enforcing this informal institution or informal rule of you having to pay this extra money, right? So this is the informal institution. This is what we can call informal institution. We will get back to this formal institution, informal institution, formal enforcing agencies, and informal enforcing agencies later. But now we are going to answer a different question, and for this particular section of the discussion, I have taken help from Darren Asamoglu and James Robinson from their book Why Nations Fail, from a certain chapter, I think chapter 3, Engines of Prosperity and Poverty. I think that's the name of the chapter. So now we are going to the discussion of institutions, right? So they pose this question, why rich countries are rich and why poor countries are poor. So there have been many responses throughout history. Some people would say rich countries are rich because they have advantages of geography, they probably have more natural resources, they probably are culturally more laborious or industrious, or they have certain physical advantages because of the ancestry or something. They probably have a very workaholic culture, a culture of honesty. So often these responses refer to the discussions of geographical advantage, natural resources, culture, and all those things. And I don't know, they might be plausible, but what they come up with, what the response is, that they say that rich countries are rich because the rich countries are rich and they can sustain their rich because they have good institutions in most cases, and poor countries are poor because they have bad institutions. Let's take a look at this world map, this satellite image, and they show that here we have North Korea and South Korea, and uh, these two countries were practically one single country, Korea, but they got divided along the line of 38th parallel, I guess. There was this chapter, the economics of 38th parallel. So if you take this image from satellite at night, you see that North Korea is dark. Just there is this tiny dot of light in Pyongyang, where probably some sort of economic activity is taking place and some sort of growth is taking place. And for this reason, you have some sort of light there. But South Korea is very bright, even at night, even when it's dark, because you would assume that there's a lot of economic activity, growth, electricity, outreach in all across South Korea. This is also reflected in other data as well, because you know that South Korea is a country which has tremendous growth, which has done great in technology. So people's standard of life is somewhat a lot better. And of course, you know that we don't know much about North Korea, but from whatever we know that their people are not really better off. And they're the thing is, these two countries were actually one country. So you cannot really use the geography argument. You cannot really use the culture argument. Because the people were kind of similar in nature. They have the same ancestry, and also there was this example in the book that there were two brothers who got separated. One went to North Korea and one went to South Korea, and then there was this reunion organized by these two states, and it was clearly visible how the North Korean people were significantly worse off and the South Korean people were significantly better off. So this shows that there's something else at play apart from this culture or geography arguments. And this is where they come in. They say the South Korea has good institutions that drove them to prosperity. North Korea has bad institutions that drove them to poverty. Also, there are other examples of Latin America. There were regions where there were some forms of forced labor like Mita, and there were other areas where they had encomienda. We're not going to talk about that, but we're not going to talk about those things. But there are examples where the same region, but since they had different institutions, we could clearly see a difference in impact in terms of poverty and people's well-being. Some people were better off and some people were worse off. So Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson, they classify institutions in two parts. One is economic institutions and one is political institutions. So this is something that they didn't explicitly do, and I'm not going to do that as well. I'm not going to talk about what are these economic institutions. I'm going to talk about what happens in a country that has good economic institutions, what happens in a country that has bad economic institutions. Here, let's say I'm of course paraphrasing them, more in simpler terms. So the good economic institutions are inclusive economic institutions. So the bad economic institutions are extractive economic institutions. So good economic institutions are those, if you have these inclusive economic institutions in your country, people are free to choose what sort of career they want to have. People are free to choose what sort of business they want to do. People are allowed to enter into market with their businesses. But and if you are living in a country where inclusive economic institutions exist, your property is also probably protected. We'll get to them later. But if you're living in a country with extractive economic institutions, you probably do not have secure property rights. Your property might be taken away by someone else. You do not get to decide what sort of career you want to go for. It can be forced as well. You cannot get into new businesses, and your public services and public goods can be funneled, can be extracted to feed the elites or a certain informal powerful group at the top. And this is why the extraction happens, right? So this is why we are calling it extractive economic institutions. So let's look at them in detail. So we have economic institutions where we have inclusive economic institutions and we have extractive economic institutions. Now let's talk about the property. So I have already talked about property rights, the secure private property rights. For example, you have bought this land. If you are living in a country where it has inclusive economic institutions, your land will be protected because you are the owner. You can show documents and you can go to court. The court will work in a very unbiased manner. The police will work in a very unbiased manner, and your property will be protected. But in a country with extractive economic institutions, the opposite will happen. You will not have secure property right. In fact, the opposite of it, there will probably be people who would come and would seek rent, would do chadabaji, and would want to extract money from you, and then at every level you would probably have to pay more money to protect your property, and then there might be someone politically powerful who would come and forcefully accumulate in a very primitive manner your property or your land, or would probably grab your land. And even state might do it, and they might not provide you enough compensation for it, and they might just get away with it because you cannot hold them accountable. So if you're living in a country with extractive economic institutions, those things can happen. If you're living in a country with inclusive economic institution, your lands could be protected. I would like to share this personal story of mine. When I often ask my students and other people, why do you want to go for BCS and why do you want to join Bangladesh Civil Service? They would often respond that we want the power. And when I would ask what this power actually looks like, they would tell me, of course, they talk about status, but when I ask for more tangible examples, they would say, for example, my father has this land and this land is disputed, or some other groups of people, they want this land, and if I am in civil service or if I am in military, I would probably have the power to stop it, or I would probably have the power to protect this land. So you see, this power is not really always power. This power can be sometimes dubbed as survival mechanism for people in developing countries, in certain developing countries where the property right is not secured, because they want to get into positions of power in administration, in military. uh, some probably have bad intentions, but for some people it might also be a survival strategy, because they just simply want to protect their land, protect their father's industry, or protect their father's land, or protect their own private assets. If you have a song, if you have a film, and if it is pirated, if someone else copies your work, and if you do not have strong patent laws, if you have made a discovery but then a corporation grabbed it and screwed you over, those things can happen where you do not have secure property rights, the intellectual property as well. So the second is a very obvious unbiased system of law, because if you are living in a country with inclusive economic institutions, you probably have unbiased system of law as well, where law is equally applied to all classes of people, all works of people. If you are living in an if you are living in a country with extractive economic institution, you're probably not going to get access to law. You're probably not going to get access to justice. Law is probably not going to be applied to everyone equally, and this is exactly again why people in developing countries want to get into positions of power, so that they can be exempted from certain things, because they can clearly see in a country with scarce resources, there are people who are in positions of power, there are people who are in forces, there are people in administration. They can do things and they can get away with them. They can tweak the laws, they can tweak the rules, and nobody bats an eye, and nobody can do anything. So they want to get to the position so that they can avail those privileges, and as we'll get to see later, that how they can avail those resources as well. But these are very obvious discussions, but we are trying to somehow form an analysis of them here. So in extractive economic institutions, you do not have this unbiased system of law. Law is probably not going to protect you. But also, these do not consider them to be extreme opposites, that you either have to have very secure property right, or you have to have very bad property right. It can be a spectrum where you can be in a country where private property right is very secure, you can be in a country where it's an absolute chaos, and you can be in the middle somewhere else as well. Let's consider all these things as two ends of a spectrum. If you're living in a country with good economic institutions, you probably have uh, good public services for all sorts of people, and these public services create this level playing ground for people so that they can have fair exchange and contracts. If you're living in a country with extractive economic institutions, you probably do not have adequate public services for everyone, and thus it leads to not having fair exchanges, not having fair contracts, and certain group of people always benefits from it. And there is the discussion of entry of new businesses. If you're in an inclusive economic institution, if you're in a country with inclusive economic institution, you're probably okay with entry of all new businesses because you want free market to operate in its own way and you want new competitors, new entries in the market. You are not going to try to, even if someone wants to try to block the entry of new competitors or new companies in the market, the institutions are designed in a way that they would block those interests and they would always encourage more participation, more competition, so that the consumer is benefited and also the economy is benefited in a greater sense, right? But if you are living in a country with extractive economic institutions, probably the institutions would be designed in a way that only benefits the certain elites, certain groups of people, certain oligopolies, and they're probably going to block entry of new businesses so that new businesses cannot come, new businesses cannot disrupt their existing share of the pie. And thus, even if you want to open a new business, you can be structurally disincentivized because you don't have good interest rates in banks. You don't have a very friendly bureaucracy who would help you if you're coming from foreign countries, foreign organizations. If you want to uh, open something in a different country, if that country has extractive economic institutions, they're probably not going to be very cooperative unless you appease to this powerful elite group or this powerful informal group of people. So thus new businesses and diversification in business sector do not take place as well. And people's autonomy over careers, it might be a little difficult to grasp because people can choose their careers, but what uh, we can take Amartya Sen's capability approach kind of here. So Amartya Sen's capability approach would say this is not about this is about what is the range of options that you have. What you end up doing is your choice, but before making that choice, did you have only two options or did you have like 10 options or 12 options and 15 options? So you were capable of going for any of those 15 options, but you chose to do this thing. For example, you could have chosen 15 different professions. You could have chosen to invest your money or invest your time and labor in 15 different disciplines of education, but you chose only one and you chose that career. But in a country, you kind of have only two options for education or for skills, and you only have to go for one, or you probably are destined or forced to take only one career. So if you're living in a country with inclusive economic institutions, you probably have a lot of options and you get to choose where you want to dedicate your time, resource and talent and merit, and you go for that career. If you're in a slightly more extractive institution ridden country, you probably do not have all these uh, options if you're living in Congo or if you're living in Haiti. And also in countries like North Korea where you have conscription, or in countries where you have forced labor, so even if you want to do something else, you cannot do that. Probably the person who could have uh, invented a cure for cancer or a cure for HIV or a cure for coronavirus, that person is probably currently working in the military in North Korea because he was probably the gifted guy, but he didn't get to choose what he wanted to do because his state made him do something else, right? So these are economic institutions, and when you have inclusive economic institutions, you also have two further drivers of development or progress, which are education and technology. Why? Because if you're living in a country with inclusive economic institution, your property right is protected, your property right is secure. Uh, if you do foreign direct investment, they are likely to be secure. Uh, Entry of new businesses are allowed, and since entry of new businesses are allowed, there can be more technological innovation, more technological invention. So people are always willing to work on technology, people are always interested in working on newer solutions to public problems, public life problems, and thus new technologies are invented. And this is why we would see, according to Darren Asamoah and James Robinson, South Korea and USA, these are countries which have kind of inclusive economic institutions, although we might have deviated from that point somewhere. But let's for the sake of this discussion, let's look at the structure. And these countries do have inclusive economic institutional structure. And this is why Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, uh, Larry Page, Sergey Brin, all these people were accommodated in USA. They came through that US system. Some people went from other countries and went to USA because they could do all these technological innovations, inventions, and they could access the market. And when you have this growth in technology, two things happen. Since you have new technologies in the country, since you have new technologies in the economy, the workforce, the people, they feel the need that yes, we need to acquire more skills. So your education also gets better. What you do is, in education, you provide newer skills to your workforce so that they can use these newer technologies and do something with it. But furthermore, you feel that yes, new innovations and new inventions are needed, because if I have new inventions in technology, I can access the market and I can benefit from it. So you also want to be the inventors, you also want to be the innovators. So look at the previous inventions or innovations that we had. Those are very simpler innovations that people made through observations or, of course, methodical discoveries. But in modern days, we have more sophisticated innovations, and these more sophisticated innovations require more advanced level of education and imparting of skills, transfer of skills. And this is why education also gets better in these countries. And thus, with technology and education, inclusive economic institutions lead to more prosperity, more development of a country. In extractive economic institutions, if it is North Korea, you're probably just going to learn about certain propaganda, and your education is probably going to be around that idea as well. Even in countries like Bangladesh, we see a huge skill mismatch in terms of education, because the education doesn't really cater to the uh, need for the potential future workforce in order to be able to work in certain sectors, because the private sector and the technology and the industries themselves are not sufficiently or adequately flourished that they would uh, enable the uh, students, the young people, to choose certain different skill oriented education as well, and hence this growth does not take place. So uh, let's talk about the political institutions now. So we understand that there are inclusive economic institutions and there are extractive economic institutions. Now the question is, why would who would pick extractive economic institutions, and why someone would pick extractive economic institutions if extractive economic institutions are so bad, if inclusive economic institutions are so good, and if inclusive economic institutions benefit everyone, why would people go for extractive economic institutions in the first place? And you can guess. So there is this informal group of people, there is this informal group of powerful people. You can call them informal networks, you can call them informal institutions as well, you can call them elites. So they want extractive economic institutions so that they can get all the benefit, they can get all the pie to themselves. Now how do they do that? Can they just do that because I feel like I want extractive economic institutions so that I can get all the benefit to myself? Can they really do that? They can do that when they win the game of politics, which means it's a game of politics. The people who win, and they get to decide what sort of economic institutions we are going to have, and this is why political institutions is important. So let's first get to some basic concepts. So when we talk about politics, we basically mean, for this discussion, the process through which you get to decide or you get to elect what form of governance you want, who you want to be governed by, who you want to lead you. And of course you don't always have a say in it if you're living in an authoritarian regime, but that's also a form of selection, right? That through that nature of politics, a certain form of governance emerges. So we have a few different types of political institutions. You can have pluralistic political institutions, which is again good political institutions. You can call it inclusive political institutions, because here you see that the power is not concentrated at the top. In certain countries, power is concentrated at the top, probably North Korea. Maybe in a country that live in, I don't know. But there are countries where power is kind of distributed. The chief person has certain power. There are decentralized power all across the country at different administrative units, right? And this power is constrained, which means that you cannot do whatever you want to do. So whatever you do, you would probably have to be accountable, or you would probably have to be responsible to answer for those actions in the parliament, in the legislation, in the legislature, and you would have to answer for these actions in front of media. So your powers are constrained. If you want to build a wall, you cannot simply build a wall in the border. There would be people, there would be checks in the system who would block you, and you would have to convince them, or you would have to get through them in the first place. So if that exists, if you have a broad distribution of power, and if this power is constrained by checks, then you have pluralistic political institutions. But if the power is not at all constrained, and if the power is not distributed, the power is at the top and it is not at all constrained, then you have absolutist regimes, for example North Korea. And there are also countries, mostly you would see countries in Africa where you would see a lot of conflict, because there is absolutely no form of centralization, because the power is distributed, but it's not a good distribution, because this distribution is among different groups. So you are accountable to the other group, and they're always at this conflict, and this power is distributed so much that their centralization is of this power is not possible. So an example would be Somalia. So if we look at it in political institutions, the inclusive political institutions would be where we have broad distribution of power, and that is constrained, and also that the power is centralized, which is like a very basic condition. Then we would say that yes, this country has inclusive political institutions. But if we have broad distribution of power and constrained, but it's not centralized, as in Somalia and other countries, where there are conflicts because there are different groups of people always at conflict, and they cannot centralize or consolidate the power in one certain structure. So we would call them countries with extractive political institutions. For them, the takeaway is, for them, the first pathway for development would be to somehow form a centralized government, to somehow form a centralized governance system that is adhered to by everyone. So you can make them inclusive, you can understand them, or it might lead to something else as well. But if not, there would always be infighting, and there would always be breaking down of the system, right? But we are not going to discuss a lot about them. We are only going to discuss about countries that have some sort of centralization and consolidation of power within themselves. So the next could be where probably we have centralized governance system, but there is no broad distribution of power, and this power is not constrained. So these are countries with extractive political institutions. You can talk about North Korea, you can talk about China, you can talk about Bangladesh as well. I assume that we don't have, in effect, a very broad distribution of power, and this power is again not very constrained, because probably media cannot rigorously question them, and you cannot hold them accountable always, right? So now the question is, we have discussed economic institutions, good economic institutions and bad economic institutions. We have discussed good political institutions and bad political institutions, as in we have discussed inclusive economic institutions, inclusive political institutions, extractive economic institutions and extractive political institutions. What is the relation between them? So Acemoglu and Robinson says that in economic institutions and political institutions, they kind of work in a loop, they kind of work in a cycle. So I have, for example, I have only talked about extractive, but they could as well be inclusive as well. So extractive economic institutions lead to extractive political institutions, and then extractive political institutions lead to extractive economic institutions. It could very much as well be inclusive political institutions leading to inclusive economic institutions, and inclusive economic institutions leading to inclusive political institutions. How does that work? So if you are living in a country with extractive political institutions, your power is concentrated probably at the top, and that power is unconstrained, unrestrained. No one is putting any check or balance that power. So you get to do what you want. It can vary in different degrees, and when that's a possibility, when that happens, you probably get to access a bigger share of the pie. Even if it's not you, it's probably your cronies, it's probably your friends, it's probably your loyalists who get to access. And they design the economic institutions in a way where they grab people's properties and get away with it because they're friends with people who have a lot of power but unquestioned power. Then they grab those properties, then they grab those patents, then they don't allow you to enter the businesses, then they force people to work somewhere, and then they get away with it because either they are in power, unchallenged power, or they are friends or loyalists to people with unchallenged power. So extractive political institutions eventually lead to extractive economic institutions. And if you have extractive economic institutions, you have this incentive to protect this extractive political institution as well, because you are currently benefiting from the extractive economic institution. So you have all the reasons to protect the extractive political institution so that you have the access to unchallenged power as well. But you can say, what if there is a change in regimes? Throughout the history, we have also seen, even if there was this change in regime, the next group of people who were previously excluded, they also have this incentive to maintain the status quo and not really do significant changes, not really do substantial changes, because now they are the new players who are getting benefited from these extractive economic institutions, and hence they have all the incentives to protect those extractive political institutions. The same goes for inclusive economic institutions and inclusive political institutions. If you have inclusive political institutions, you are more likely to allow new businesses, you are more likely to protect the property rights, and that will eventually lead to growth through inclusive economic institutions. Now, there might be a question. So if extractive economic institutions are so bad, so and if they do not generate any growth, why would elites want to do it? Because eventually if the growth runs out, eventually if the growth stops and there is no pie to get to begin with, why would extractive institutions want to do it? You kind of know the answer, and let's explore the answer. That it's not that extractive political institutions cannot generate any growth or cannot generate any prosperity. In fact, they can generate growth or prosperity as well. So how does growth take place under extractive political institutions? So this happens when elites realize that yes, we need economic growth within the country because we need benefits for ourselves. And then what they do is they take high productivity activities, and in areas where they can control, they are not willing to share it, they're not willing to allow probably new businesses, they're probably doing land grabbing, they're probably doing assets grabbing, and they're getting away with it. They're making people work, they're probably going for conscription or forced labor, but they allocate these high productivity activities in areas where they can control, and that might trickle down to some growth. So there are examples in Barbados and in those Caribbean countries between 16th century and 18th century. This is something that Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson, they talk about. In those countries, there were plantation farms, the sugar plantation farms, and the owners of these sugar plantation farms, they owned slaves. So they had slavery. So that is forced labor. So if you were born into a community where people were forced to work as slaves, so if you don't really have any pathway, you cannot really go for good education, you cannot really go for good health, you have to work as a slave, you have to be exploited, you are not going to get the wage that you are supposed to get for this kind of work because you have been sold to these sugar plantation owners. And these sugar plantation owners, they had access to justice system as well, they had access to court, probably the justices, a significant portion of them were also sugar plantation owners or somehow related to them. So the entire power structure was exploited by these sugar plantation owners. So they produced a lot of sugar, they sold them worldwide, and they generated a lot of growth that probably trickled down to some of the other people as well. But this growth is mostly for themselves. So they also give this example of Soviet Union, where they from 1928 to 1970, I guess, so where they shifted from agriculture, where the resources were inefficiently managed, and they took these resources, this certain group of people, this certain group of elites, they took these resources from agriculture and they allocated these resources to industrialization, new industries, and that generated growth. But for a certain period of time, eventually it ran out. We'll get to that later. There is another way the elite can do this. If the elites feel very secure about their position in the country, they think that nothing is going to harm them, nothing is going to threaten them, and nothing is going to challenge their position. What they do is they allow economic institutions to be a little inclusive, as in they allow some degree of technological innovation, they allow some degree of technological invention. Because in many countries, for example Soviet Union, or in countries where they go for the primary shift to industry, but then they closed down because they are very comfortable with the industry from where they are extracting their resources, and they don't allow new entries in the market, they don't allow new technological innovation or invention, so that they don't want other people to get ahead of them, they don't want new people to get more money, they don't want new people to get, they don't want more new rich people to begin with. So they don't want this creative destruction of old ways. They want to extract more from what they already have, where they have some sort of comparative advantage on, and they would want to protect and maintain that status quo, right? So but if the elites are somewhat secure about what they're doing, and they think that nothing is probably going to challenge my position or threaten me, then they're willing to somehow design the institutions in a way where they are a little more inclusive, where more technological invention and innovation can occur, because they think that this is not going to harm them or hurt them. So this is something that happened during the General Park's regime in South Korea, because that was also an authoritarian regime in design, but the elites felt that they were secured, and the people in power felt they were secured, and so the industrialization had a lot of technological innovation and inventions, and thus even with extractive political institutions, we saw some degree of inclusive economic institutions. Now, you can ask this question: if South Korea was actually uh, under extractive political institutions, how did they generate this growth, or how did they go for inclusive economic institutions? So this is also a response taken from Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson. So they say that the political institutions eventually became inclusive. So first, they realized that the elites felt very secure, or they realized that we need to go for growth, and they allowed for certain degree of inclusive economic growth, inclusive economic institutions. And when inclusive economic institutions took place, the political institutions in turn also became inclusive, because the economic elite had little to gain from dominating politics, because they saw now there is so much growth that even if we let go of our access to power, we are not going to be significantly worse off. This is not going to hurt us. Probably that was one of the reasons, as I understood from that book. And also there was this relative equality within the country because of the inclusive economic growth and the technological growth. So they felt that we don't need to hold our access to power, because understand this, having your access to power can also be very expensive, can also be very costly. You would have to pay your patrons. So if you have this patron client relationship, if I'm a client, if I'm a businessman, and if I have to pay the patron, the politician or someone else, that can also be expensive. So if I have a country where uh, if I have acquired that technological capability where I can sustain in a meritocracy, I don't need to pay for I don't need to pay for access to that extractive political institutions. In fact, I'm going to benefit more from having inclusive political institutions. And this probably happened in South Korea. But also there is this other element, because within that country there was this growing movement of people for democracy, and also USA was a friend, North Korea, because of the North Korea's presence and North Korea's threats. So we cannot simply discard those as well. So this is how South Korea had growth, even with extractive political institutions. But for this next part of the discussion, I'm going to take help from Mushtaq Khan, Bangladeshi economist currently teaching in SOAS of the University of London, I guess. Yes. So he talked about political settlement, and so here the question that I pose, I'll try to wrap it up soon. Here the question he poses, and you all might think, so what is the takeaway? How can we go for progress? So you can go for progress under extractive political institutions as well. You might generate some growth in shorter run, but Darren Acemoglu and Robinson says that is not going to be a sustainable thing if you cannot eventually go for inclusive political institutions, and if your political institutions are always extractive political institutions, the economic growth will not be sustainable. And there are reasons to believe them, because there are countries which had extractive political institutions. Originally, they allowed some degree of industrialization and had some degree of growth. But since they did not change their political structure, since they did not change their political system, so the people who got benefited from those some degree of inclusive economic institutions, some degree of technological change, they held on to that and then again went for extractive economic institutions, and the growth kind of stagnated and there has not been more growth. And there are people who are living in poverty in those regions. You can talk about Russia and other countries. So now the question really is, how do we get out of that? How do we get out of these extractive political institutions? I don't know a clear answer to that question, but let's try to understand these extractive political institutions and why these institutions are extractive in nature, because there are powerful elites, there are these informal groups who capture these political institutions. So let's ask a very obvious question. Who are these powerful people? Who are these informal groups? And why do they capture these political institutions? So according to Mushtaq Khan, in his write-up, he says, because these are the people who are not very capable inherently, which means that they do not have those entrepreneurial capability, they do not have those managerial capability. In a free market, if it was a meritocracy, they would not have won. Imagine this, Elon Musk, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Larry Page, Sergey Brin, they all are born in Bangladesh, or they are all born in some other country with extractive political institutions. But so they want to access the market, but the banks are not supporting them, the credit system is not supporting them, they do not have enough people with skills and resources, because the education is not strong. People do not have enough options to go for their careers. But also when they want to open up a business, at the same time someone some member of parliament's son-in-law or some minister's son-in-law also wants a stake in the game, also either wants to be a partner, or that person might want to do a similar business, a similar different business. So Elon Musk goes for Tesla, someone goes for Fesla, but the Fesla is protected, is facilitated by the government, because the owner is connected to the political party, the owner has this patron-client relationship, and guys like Elon Musk lose out, right? But that guy probably do not have the technological capability, that guy probably does not have this entrepreneurial capability or managerial capability, and in an open market, in a competition, would probably have lost out to Jeff Bezos or Steve Jobs or Bill Gates. But since this person does not have that entrepreneurial capability but does have some sort of access to power, they want to capture the power and they want to get benefit from them. And now the problem is, and that's fine, and that's fine as well, if this guy who is a political winner, who defeated let's say Steve Jobs or Jeff Bezos, a potential Steve Jobs or Jeff Bezos, because he has access to power, he has access to unchallenged power in extractive political institutions, that's fine. even with that, growth can occur if that guy who did not have this entrepreneurial ability or managerial ability eventually turn into a productive entrepreneur. But since this guy, who's a moron, who's a stupid, and does not have enough capability, without without strong capabilities, with very little capabilities, with very little uh, entrepreneurial or managerial knowledge, since he is gaining so much, as in he has to invest very few, he has to invest very less in self development, in the development of his organization or in the development of his business, but he gets so much profit out of it. And this can be termed as rent seeking, because you are getting undeserved, undue profit or benefit from the economic system. Since you are getting this, you don't have any incentive to actually convert or transform into a productive entrepreneur, because you know that the political system will be like this, and you have all the incentives to protect the political system like this, and you are also getting benefit from it. So you are not really willing to be a productive entrepreneur and do more and uh, generate prosperity. But furthermore, they also capture political institutions, because let's say I'm in power and I have this son-in-law or some relative or some client who wants to open up this business and I want to help them. So a formal process, a formal institutional approach would be to subsidize them, to bail them out of misery, to provide uh, subsidies from the tax money of people, saying that we want to protect this business. But this is very, again, difficult to justify, because in a country you are not thinking about welfare of the poor people, but you are openly saying that I'm going to give this company a bailout, or I'm going to give this company tax cut, or I'm going to particularly give this company a subsidy, although that happens to some extent, but these are difficult to justify, and hence you don't go for a formal institutional approach. And you remember I talked about informal institutional approach. You go for informal arrangements, so you can have a sustained access to these incomes. So this is why these informal groups of people who are kind of close to the power structure, or probably are in power structure, they have access to political institutions, and thus they eventually design the economic institutions in a way that block the entry of new businesses, that block the career paths of other people, and thus they want to generate growth. But eventually that growth is short lived, because they are not in the long run converted into productive entrepreneurs or good entrepreneurs, right? And now you can come up and you can say, all right, so there are problems, but maybe we can instill values of good governance, we can teach them about accountability and governance. And Mushtaq Khan then talks about why that is not going to work and why that is going to fail. Because he says there are initiatives in developing countries, right? There are development organizations who want to fix the governance, they want to teach you all about they want to increase the performance of the bureaucracy, the administration, they want to increase the transparency and accountability in the system, they want to ensure better management, and they think that these are going to work, but these actually do not work. So even if you do these performance management, this accountability, the citizen charter, eventually this is not going to work, because the powerful informal groups or the elites are always going to block them, are always going to block any initiative that is actually in their way. And that is the reality we don't often talk about, because these political institutions are structured in a way so these powerful elites will always block or resist any initiative, any reform that would take away from their shares of pie. And how do they maintain this informal arrangement? I have already talked that they do this through patron client network or clientelism, where they have a patron probably within the political party or in the power, and they have clients, they have these loyalists, the businessmen, the other groups of people, and they want to maintain this access. So anything that blocks their access to income, this undue income, this undeserved income, they're going to block that. So you can do governance initiatives, projects where more accountability and more transparency, you can try to do them, but they are not going to bring big, meaningful, substantial changes. So now let's talk about the political settlements. Settlements I have already defined to some extent. According to Mushtaq Khan, a political settlement is a combination of power and institutions that is mutually compatible. and also sustainable in terms of economic and political viability, which what it means is that the people with power, they're going to you cannot do, what it implies is you cannot do an institutional change, you cannot do an institutional reform if that is not compatible with the interest of the people in the power. So if you want to go for an institutional change or reform that is going to hurt the interest of the ruling elites, hurt the interest of the of people who are currently powerful, that is not going to work. And thus they are all only going to allow those institutional reforms that benefit them. But also this is going to, this equilibrium is going to, this compatibility is going to work only so far as there is certain degree of economic viability, there is certain degree of economic growth within the country, so that everything does not fall apart, and there is certain degree of political stability as well. But if any of those things gets unstable, there is a chance this compatibility or equilibrium might be disrupted. But so is this all bleak? We don't know. I will get to some takeaways. What can we do? What, it's not what can we do, it's what if these certain things happen, these countries with extractive political institutions or these developing countries might develop. This is not about suggesting or prescribing or advising. If we see these things occurring, we might see development. So I'll get to them at the end of this very long session. I'm really sorry. So now the question is, why do we have these informal groups to begin with? So first we talked about why there is this informal institutions. Why do these informal institutions access political power, and why do they try to capture political institutions? That was the first question that I answered. Then I talked about why, even if you want to bring good governance and such initiatives through development organizations, why they are less likely to work and why they are more likely to fail, because those people who are not good entrepreneurs, who are not good businessmen, they don't have enough capability, they access those power structure, and they also don't develop themselves because they don't have to, because developing themselves is actually expensive. But even without doing that, they are getting a lot of rent, a lot of profit, undue profit or undeserved profit, and thus they're also generating extractive economic institutions and blocking other people and getting all the benefits. But how did we have all these informal groups? How did these informal groups form to begin with? So that is a very basic and fundamental question, and let's explore this question. According to Mushtaq Khan, in developing countries, the reason we have these informal groups is because, see, the power in the developed countries, or in countries where we see capitalism in full effect, as in the capitalism is properly formalized, there the power is accounted by the formal productive sector. So if in a formal productive sector, if you're a meritorious entrepreneur, if you're a meritorious manager in a formal productive sector, through formal processes, using formal institutions, you acquire those powers. In developing countries, unlike developed countries, your entire economy is not accounted for by all these formal sectors. You have a lot more informal productive sectors or informal economic sectors, right? And since these economies, they are largely informal, what happens that informal economy relies on, in most cases, or informal economies also fosters informal arrangements within people. You are not really going for formal recruitment, you are not really going for formal licenses, you are not really going for a formal structure. You are often doing it on the basis of a very informal network, on an informal arrangement and informal practices. You are not always going for very formal contracts. So you don't have this formal a culture of formal institutions. You don't always have these formal practices, and thus you go for informal networks, informal recruitment, informal understanding between people. So there is a culture of informality, And this leads to informal networks, because you understand, if I need to get this work done, I need to access someone informally. But also the power in the society is not generated from the formal sector. So it's not the person who gives the most tax. That person is probably not the most powerful person in the country. There is probably someone else who is uh, out there extracting a lot of money from the informal sector through informal means, through informal arrangements, and they are more powerful than the person who actually pays the most tax through a formal system. That person probably does not have the uh, most degree of power within the economy. The person who has the most degree of power is probably the person who, through informal arrangements, from informal economy or informal settlements, access more benefits. Now, why do we have these informal groups? Now let's take a look at this visual representation. Understand this. If we have this kind of two ideas where we see uh, on one hand, on the horizontal axis we have formal, this is a 2 by 2 table, and if on the horizontal axis we have formal institutions that can potentially support growth, and we also have formal institutions that are not very growth oriented, or there are formal institutions which have failed. On the vertical axis we have holding power. You don't need to be concerned about holding power. Let's talk about power aligned with formal institutions, and then we have uh, power that is not aligned with formal institutions, the power that comes from informal institutions, or the power that comes from informal networks. We see the developed countries, the countries that have actually acquired capitalism, that countries that have actually realized or materialized capitalism. They are the countries on the first quadrant. On the top left you can see capitalist political settlement. So these are countries where they have formal institutions that potentially support growth, and their power also stems from formal institutions. So these are countries from where we get this development aid, from where we get these prescriptions, from where we get these policy suggestions. And that is problematic, because they think if they give us governance values, good governance values, that is going to work. But our countries, these developing countries, they do not have this formal capitalistic political settlement to begin with. Our countries, before the capitalism came to our countries, before capitalism came to these developing countries, in the pre-capitalistic era, we had some sort of pre-capitalistic political settlement. Probably there were monarchs, there were feudal system, and there were some sort of formal institutions. They probably didn't result in much growth, or those institutions got abolished. Those formal institutions have collapsed now, because we are not in a pre-capitalistic system now. Through colonization, we are going for the capitalistic settlement, we are going for the capitalistic arrangement. And in a full-fledged capitalistic settlement, we were supposed to have uh, the most of the economy would have accounted for formal economy, or formal means, or formal processes, and the power is also supposed to be generated from these formal institutions. But the problem is we have a clientelistic political settlement in these developing countries, because the formal productive rights, they exist, but they are not very well enforced. You cannot enforce them, and powerful groups can influence the economic outcomes irrespective of their formal rights. So even if they do not have formal rights, but if they have those informal accesses to power, they can enforce uh, those institutions, and they can extract those economic outcomes. And there could be a different developing countries could be at different points, but they have these clientelistic political settlements. I'm not going to talk about political settlements in crisis, but get the idea. So the developing countries are kind of in a transitioning state, and by transition you might think, oh, so we are kind of transitioning from pre-capitalistic political settlement Now we are in clientelistic political settlement, and then we are going to capitalistic political settlement. That would be your expectation when you hear the word transitioning. But the problem is these countries have been in transition for way too long, and they are not really going for a proper formalization of the economy, or they're not really going for the formal economy. Rather, they are in this adha khetra obostha. They are in this transitioning state. They're stuck in this transitioning state, and where they have certain elements of the previous era, or where they have certain elements of these informal groups accrue more power, although there are certain attributes of formal institution and formal economy as well, and that is problematic. And why do we have these informal groups? So finally the answer would be, how did we come to have these informal groups? This again ties back to colonialism for a lot of the developing countries, because a lot of the developing countries were previously colonized. It could be India, Bangladesh, and all other countries. There were Spanish colonies, there were other European colonies, and what the colonial rulers did was, because they wanted to sustain their political influence, because they wanted to sustain their regimes, because they wanted to have a stability while they rule, what they did was they picked certain groups of people. They picked certain groups of people and gave them more benefits than others. And then those groups of people became loyalists to these colonial rulers, and then they collaborated with the colonial rulers in the beginning. Although it is ironic, as Mushtaq Khan says, more often they are also the ones who revolted against these colonial rulers. But there was this culture, it began this way, that the rulers pick certain groups of people, they want them to be happy, they provide them benefits, and thus form a coalition. You can also call it a ruling coalition or winning coalition, because they want stability in their regimes, and thus they pick certain groups of people and give them benefits. So after colonization, they probably also wanted to maintain that status quo where certain groups of people can access more benefit than the others. This can also happen when a country is newly independent, because those who benefited in the previous system, in the previous uh, structure of the country, they are now excluded, and those who were previously excluded from the benefits, now they come, and as I said, they have all the incentives to protect that extractive political institution. So even in Bangladesh, I think you can use, I would argue that in Bangladesh originally we saw a nationalization, a national acquisition of all the properties. But while this national acquisition of all the properties happened from 1972 to 1975, when this nationalization took place, what happened was there were abundant private properties, but there were also active private properties of Bangladeshi people as well. But those properties were acquired by the government, and then they were managed by probably party people, the people close to the party, the people the political party or the government relied on, right? And these are the people who were previously excluded from the economic benefits, and now since they have got access to this, they probably wanted to benefit more from the system. Although if you wanted to go for nationalization, you should have also gone for land reforms, but that is something that you did not do, because a lot of your power came from these rural rich landlords, or rural big farmers. So you did not want to anger them. But since you had a new country and you did not have enough industrial capital, and these rich people, they did not have really enough significant political clout or financial clout, so the people loyalists to the regime, through the nationalization of these people's industries and abandoned industries, started accruing more benefits to them. So the previously excluded groups, when a country is independent, and which is the case for a lot of developing countries, what they do, that previously excluded groups, they start capturing these institutions, and then there's no way out, and this kind of is perpetuated or is cyclic. And thus informal groups, they deprive the potentially better entrepreneurs, the potentially better managers who could have driven us to more growth, and they stop them. So what are the takeaways? So what can we do? Is this all big? Is this all doom and gloom? And are the elites always going to block any good initiative, any progress for development, for growth? That is not the case. We as we have seen. So let's go to some of the takeaways. So going back to the original question, what is the pathway for developing countries to develop? As I have discussed in the first section, in the first 20 to 22 minutes, that if development organizations are coming, or even if states are designing policies and programs, they need to design these policies and programs in a way that is based on evidences, that are based on data. These are difficult, but these are not impossible. Now let's look at some other takeaways. So if there are countries with extractive economy, I'm not going to say the country needs to do it, the people need to do it, the actors need to do it. I'm not going to prescribe anything, but I think if these things happen, if these things take place, they might eventually go for growth. So by now, you know, the central argument is we need inclusive economic institutions and inclusive political institutions. If we have inclusive political institutions and inclusive economic institutions, we will have sustained growth. If we don't have them, we might have growth in the short run, but that is not going to sustain in the long run, unless you are probably China, who have enough trading power and diplomatic power and create a region as their market, so where they, even with extractive political system, they can access, they can sustain their economy. But uh, that is probably not the case for all developing countries. So uh, now what are the takeaways? So if there are countries with extractive economic institutions, maybe the first point would be to making the economic institutions a little more inclusive. And as we have seen that extractive political in countries with extractive political institutions, you can make economic institutions more inclusive if the elites feel very secure about it, if it does not hurt their interest. And you probably don't need to outright change the entire political structure, but if you allow more innovation, if you allow more invention within the country, which is probably something that happened in Malaysia, I'm not entirely sure, but even in Malaysia there were clientelism. So the country's power structure, they wanted to protect the interest of the Malaya community more than the communities of Chinese and Indians, and they wanted Malayas to be owners or partners in all the businesses. But even in doing that, they took a very performance centric measure, as in if some sector or area was not performing better, so they took resources from that sector and invested resources in a different sector, so their bureaucracy was kind of cohesive as well. So even within an a system of extractive political institution, you can ensure a certain degree of inclusive economic institution. If an economic sector is not doing good, you take the resources and you invest it in a sector where there is potential for high productivity. You allow more businesses to enter. You create what that will lead to is, when you have more resources in high productivity sectors, when you have diversification. Look at Bangladesh's RMG sector. It has been stagnant for so long, and there has not been any technological innovation or intervention of our own, and no progress in the economy as well. And now we are facing this crisis where a significant part of our export is dependent on RMG sector, and we have not really diversified. We talk about ICT, we talk about other areas, but we have not really diversified in a long time. And this has been this way because probably these businessmen have had their interest in maintaining the status quo. But if you engage more resources, if you encourage more entrepreneurship in other areas as well, what it will lead to is there would be more high productivity sectors, and there will probably be technological innovation, creative destruction, and it will result in more employment in people. It will result in more income for new rich class as well. There will be more rich people, there will be more new entrepreneurs, and then probably there will be more fund in politics as well. And thus eventually in the longer run, we might see that the uh, even with extractive political institutions, there might be enough outside pressure out of the ruling coalition. So if you have captured the political power, and if you have a coalition with judiciary, police, other people, administration, military, and if you have made this coalition, and if there are other people who have more who have access to money as well, and eventually probably the ruling coalition will uh, fade away, and there would be other people, and there would probably be more competition in the political ecosystem as well, but I cannot tell for certainty, but that is a possibility. At least, even that is the best case scenario. So even if that does not happen, at least in the worst case scenario, you would have more growth and more people would have access to employment and income if you simply divert your resources from the badly performing sectors to good performing sectors and allow more innovation, allow new businesses, and allow people to take careers that they want. So, but the second would be, if countries with extractive political institutions start reforms, including elites in the process. We often have this idea that since elites are going to block every reform initiatives, there's no point in taking them in, or we often don't recognize them. So the people who could be troublemakers, it's important that we also take them in designing development interventions, and also understanding uh, uh, how we can actually enforce or ensure these development initiatives, these development activities, without hurting their interest in the short run. So that could be an interesting approach. So you can take people-centric reforms that do not harm the interest of the ruling elites. For example, let's say if you have already shifted from agriculture to industry in a certain country, but you probably still have very rich landlords hoarding a lot of lands, and thus the peasants, they are in a very bad situation because they don't have access to lands. They're very insecure as well. What you can do is, if you think that the rural elites are a group of people that I can simply let go, I don't really need them to be in power. So in those cases, you might go for land reforms. And historically, I have seen that the countries that have gone for land reforms resulted in a lot of growth and some degree of equality in those rural areas, because these rural elites, they are very less likely to go for pro-poor reforms or go for better health or education, because the more the people in their regions have less education, have less health, the more they are likely to work for them in an exploitative manner, the more they can get to exploit them. So if I'm a rich farmer, I don't want education, I don't want health, good health in my community, I don't want alternative livelihoods. I want the people in my region to be in a very worse, in a very bad situation, and so that I can exploit them, and I and make them work. So, and if you go for land reforms where you distribute the lands more equitably, more equally, so they lose that power, and thus you have new farmers, more new people with more access to lands where they would try to grow more, and more people would have access to money now that will have a significant impact in the economy. And so this is how you can probably let go of this uh, rural elites if they're not very important for your power structure. But if they're very important for your power structure, that is probably not going to happen. But if a country recognizes that this is the group of elites that I do not really need to cater to because I don't get anything from them politically or probably economically, so those are the regions where probably reforms can take place first, because they do not have that significant political power in those regions. But also, if you can show them that, see, if we do not invest in these reforms, if we do not go for a better public health system, if we do not go for a better education, that is eventually going to hurt you. For example, there was this study by Institute of Development Studies. I read this working paper where they argued that the elites are very less likely to invest in health because they think that they are not going to be harmed if there is a health disaster, because these people probably have more money, so they can go to private hospitals, or since they are very politically connected, they can access the best health care. Or maybe they would go to foreign countries, they would go to abroad, and they would avail those better healthcare systems. But wink wink, coronavirus, you can see that you cannot really go to foreign countries, you cannot really go to abroad. And now the elites are stuck. So if you can somehow pose this threat that, see, if you don't invest in the general public service, if you don't invest, and if we cannot ensure the general interest of public in the country, that will eventually bite you back as well. The elites, apparently they are very interested in education because that's feasible, that looks good, and also that is probably going to help them when they are a good workforce and work for their factories. So the areas where you can go for reforms, where you can go for initiatives where elites have certain interest in, the pro people initiatives and reforms, of course, you can probably bring those elites in. A, that could be one area, and B, another area would be the elites who are not really important, letting go of them and generating some sort of reforms, and thus you ensure certain degree of inclusive economic institutions in those certain areas that might eventually lead to a broader inclusive political institution. That's just my hypothesis, that's just me thinking out loud. Another takeaway could be the increasing the competency and bureaucracy, efficiency of bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is something that we don't talk about in debates, in intellectual circles. Probably they're very unappealing to talk about. We talk about private sector managers, we talk about corporations and managers in corporations, but we never talk about public managers, and we don't talk about managers in public administration or civil services. It's particularly very important that you have them. They are better motivated. If you look at Bangladesh right now, you will see even in the coronavirus crisis, there are local administrators who are going for online-based solutions, internet-based solutions, more technology, delivery. They are creating markets for farmers. They are creating markets for local people. They are trying their there have been evidences where we can see that they're really trying to make a change, but the problem really is that the bureaucrats or the policymakers at the top, we have not seen enough foresightedness or vision from them. So you need to create incentives in a way where your best people are recruited. They want to opt into civil service, and they want to opt into civil service for the good reasons. They don't want to opt into civil service because they want to appease the ruling political government, and their accountability should not be held to ruling political government, the ruling political party. Their accountability should be to performance, where they can perform better. And also you need to stop recruiting from elites. This is something that happened in Pakistan. If you look at it, uh, in Pakistan, the people in the civil service, they were actually from the elites, the elite families. So these are the people who uh, came from the families who were either rural landlords, or who were either people who worked in British India civil service, and then their sons and then their sons joined the Pakistan bureaucracy or Pakistani civil service. So that is a problem, because these are the people who are disconnected from the rural people. These are the people who are disconnected from the everyday lives of people. So we need to ensure that we have people who are motivated, who are committed to the public service, and we need to increase this attitude of public service in them as well, because of the ghost of the colonial administration. So if you look at it, in UK or in England, you would probably see public service managers who are more committed to serving the people. But in their colonies, these administrators were like rulers, because they were like babus. And this is why, even if they have left, we have this ghost in our public administration or in our civil service, because now we have people who aspire to be in those positions, because they also want to be these babus, they also want to be these rulers of those regions. So that is not the right motivation for joining civil service. uh, Joining civil service so that you can get extra privileges or advantages from the power structure, that is not the right incentives. We need more motivated, committed people in the civil service, in the bureaucracy of these developing countries, who are not accountable to political powers, rather more accountable to their performances and getting better policies, and working for better administration and management, and ensuring services for people, and also incorporating evidence informed policy making, uh, instead of rhetoric in developing countries, you would see a lot of rhetorics, a lot of intuition. I think this should be done. I think this should be 5%. I think this should be 10%. I think the quota for the poor people should be 5%. The quota for women should be 10%. How did you get those numbers? How did you conduct a study? Did you conduct a study where you saw the proportion of the people who are not getting access to certain privileges, and thus for the affirmative action you selected this certain number of people, this certain percentage of people? These are the questions that we also don't see media to ask. And so instead of going for rhetoric, instead of going for intuition, instead of going for vested interest, we need to incorporate more evidence induced policy making. So, and also in those processes, the rich and poor, they need to engage the elites, they need to engage the bureaucracy, the policymakers, they need to engage, and you need to take the expert pathway to policy making. So there are a few pathways to policy making. There are people, there are policies that we see that come from a very populist demand. There are policies that we see from a political ideology, which are all fine, but we need to rely more on the experts, the scientists, the social scientists, and we need to conduct studies, and we need to see the evidences for ourselves. The development organizations may come and conduct studies and prescribe in certain one or two regions, but if you're a country, if you're a state, you need to conduct your own studies, and you need to understand where you should allocate more resources, where you should provide more public services, and where you are failing. And thus you need to make policies which are more evidence driven. In fact, in countries like Bangladesh, the policies are mostly prepared by bureaucrats, but we need more participation of A, in general people, and B, the experts, definitely. So these are some of the takeaways. I'd like to end this session here. So what I have tried to do is I have tried to answer the central question, that what is the pathway for developing countries to develop. You can say that yes, we need to create a climate of investment. Yes, we need to lower the interest rate so that people are encouraged to invest. We need more technology. We need more capital. We could have talked about all of those things, and these things are talked about always, but I wanted to take a sort of different approach. So the first discussion was in the development world, whether we should give them more money, more aid, or whether we should allow them to create their own markets. And then Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo came in and showed us how we need to actually test and conduct experiments and see for ourselves what works. And from that, I went for evidence-informed program designing or policy making. But also Abhijit Banerjee also talked about the state's role and how state creates incentives and how state is accountable to provide services and why that is important. From that, I went to the discussion of institutions. In institutions, it's largely based on Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson. So I talked about how inclusive economic institutions and inclusive political institutions lead to more growth. Extractive economic institutions and extractive political institutions lead to poverty and stagnation. Although with extractive political institution, you might generate certain degree of growth, but that is not going to sustain for a very long period of time. And then the question came in, since in most of the developing countries we see extractive political institutions, why does that happen? This happens because there is a group of people who access these political institutions. They want to have extractive political institutions. And why is that? We try to explore those answers, because they are not really good managers, good entrepreneurs. They want to have this undue, undeserved profit from the system through this through the access to the political capital, and it's less expensive for them in that way, as opposed to developing themselves, as opposed to developing their industries. And how did this group of people came into being? We went to the colonial history, how from the colonial history we have seen the colonial rulers gave certain groups of people extra benefits but did not give them formal rights. So without the formal means, these groups of people probably got certain benefits. And newly independent countries, from colonization or from other countries, if a country gets independent, the previously excluded groups want to access benefits. So this structure is always there of the extractive political institution. And we are in this clientelist political settlement where you can try to impose good governance values, but those are less likely to work, because those would probably not be compatible with the interests of the elites. So how can we get away from it? How can we move forward? There is no one clear answer, but I tried to explore a certain takeaways or certain areas at the end. I don't know if it was helpful. If you have been here uh, till this point, I would like to thank you, because for having this patience to go through this. If you have comments, if you have feedbacks, you can let me know. You can let me know on Facebook, you can let me know here in the comment. I will try to respond to them. I went through a number of materials, reading materials. I went through, of course, Why Nations Fail, and also a write up on political settlements by Dr. Mustaq Khan, but also I went through a number of articles for preparing this discussion. So if you want access to or those articles, I of course did not provide them at the end as a references slide. But if you want access to them, you can let me know. I would mail them to you. Uh, I would like to thank BDC for giving me this opportunity. I was very motivated to make this video, and it helped me to prepare an answer. And I hope you all are staying safe, staying at home, and I hope I would get to see you all again sometime soon. So stay well. Thank you.